Shalom, shalom to all our many participants. I am Dina talking to you from Israel and hoping that I won't be interrupted with a red alert siren. Together with my colleague Ayala Davis and on behalf of our organization, Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, I want to welcome you to this 1 hour long program. We will get right into the subject matter, talking about the current escalation of events in Israel. Our host is Ambassador Aharoni, who serves as Global Distinguished Professor for International Relations at NYU's Faculty of Arts and Science. Ido is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service, founder of the Brand Israel program, and has been Israel's longest-serving Consul General in New York and the Tri-State area, which is Israel's largest diplomatic mission worldwide. Ido will present, and then we will open it to the questions from you, our audience. You may type your questions in the Q&A box, and Ido will try to answer as many of them as time allows. Ido, please take it away.
Thank you, Dina. This is also an opportunity to thank you and the entire staff for all the great work that you're doing year-round. And these are tough times in Israel and Jewish communities worldwide. And it's my pleasure to share with you some of the thoughts that I have. What I'd like to do is share some slides with you, and then with your permission, I'd like to really go through the slides and just to put things in perspective, give you the little bit of context. This is the fourth round of belligerency between Israel and Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip since 2006. But this one is different, and I'd like to say a few words about the difference. A few basic assumptions that we have to make in order to understand the context. The first is there is no military solution. It's very important to understand that there is no military solution. Certainly not when Hamas is introduced new military capabilities. In their cases, a wider range of the missiles with more precision, with more impact. This is something that even the Iron Dome system cannot cope with effectively, although the Iron Dome system probably saved many lives. Second basic assumption, if traditionally we thought about the soldiers in the front lines as the main concern of the society, then today home front is the key. When you have Tel Aviv under attack, when you have, if you remember during the Second Lebanon War, we had the Haifa region under attack. When you have those urban centers under severe attack, then home front becomes the key. And we'll talk, of course, today about what is happening in the home front, especially in the binational cities. Israel going into any conflict with the Palestinians is in a built-in disadvantage. It's important to understand a lot of people are frustrated with the way Israel is responding. You have to understand that a lot of it stems from the context, and the context is that Israel has the military might. Israel has the economic strength, and therefore Israel is not being perceived as the side that is weak or the side that requires or needs sympathy. It's not a question of justice, it's a question of positioning. We'll talk about that as well. The fourth basic assumption, the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, have nothing to lose. Have nothing to lose. A lot of it has to do with the Abraham Accord that left them out there in the cold. They felt that they both, the Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, as well as the supporters of the Palestinian national movement within the state of Israel. Most of them are Arabs, but there's some Jews. They feel that the Abraham Accord basically sidelined the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian plight has never been weaker. This is, if you want, a cry for help. Fifth basic assumption, the United States has bigger fish to fry. President Biden issued a statement which was basically nothing to write home about, something very routine. The United States has to deal with major issues, COVID-19, the economy, social and racial tensions, and of course climate change, which the administration self-proclaimed as the main item on their agenda. Another basic assumption, very important to understand: Israel, for whatever reason, and I'm not judging the reasons of the Israeli leadership, but the Israeli leadership went the extra mile to humiliate the Iranians. This happened the last several years, and Iran is simply waiting for the right opportune moment to launch revenge. And we see their fingerprints and their footprints all over this conflict. We'll talk about that as well. And lastly, the internal strife is deepening and is not going to go away. So these are the basic assumptions. Three things to understand about the context. The first is, when I talk about Israel's built-in disadvantage, it's because of the twinning. What happened is that Israel, for many, many years, whenever Israel was given a chance to communicate its country to the world, it spoke about the conflict with the Palestinians, thus creating a twin. In marketing, twinning is when two competing products, ideas, concepts, ideologies are competing for the same slot, for the same position. And by definition, whenever one side is making a move, it forces the other side to make a move. And this is what we're seeing here. In the process, Israel, of course, elevated the Palestinians. If you think about it, just the other day, there was a horrible attack against the Kurds conducted by the Turks. No one mentioned that in the late night shows, only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's the price that we're paying for the twinning that we ourselves created. Did not start with the current government. It started with way back then in the 1960s, even earlier in the 1950s. Whenever we had a chance, we talked about our Arab counterparts, and thus we created our own twin. The second thing is information overload. Many of you are being exposed to very unpleasant messages on social media. It's important to understand the main reason why people identify Israel as the side that is on the wrong side of the issue is because of that. People are looking for simple solutions. Israel's advantage is in the deep, historical, detailed description of the situation. When you're looking for simple explanations, Israel is in a built-in disadvantage. And lastly, this conflict is a historical conflict because it will, and that's what makes it different than the previous rounds with Gaza. It will force Israel to change its security paradigm. What do I mean by that? In the old days, we were used to believe, or we were led to believe, that the only threat that matters is a tangible threat, and usually it was an external threat. And today we're learning that intangible threats, which are also internal, are no less bothering. And the number one intangible threat is the very legitimacy of the state of Israel is being questioned. It's being questioned by celebrities, it's being questioned by people on the street, and all of you are being exposed to that. Israel's, from a strategic point of view, never really decided whether it's a victim or a victor. It's a big problem. It's a huge problem. You have a nation in Israel that is thinking and behaving like a victim, but the whole world is looking them as the aggressor. If you may, in 1967, up until 1967, Israel was the regional David, the Arab world was the regional Goliath. And in 1967, once Israel became the ruler of another people, the paradigm shifted and Israel became the regional Goliath and the Palestinians became the regional David. And the Israelis are in a severe mental jet lag as a society, not really adjusting and adapting to this new reality. What are the factors at play? On the Israeli side, obviously, the fact that we are in the midst of the aftermath of a fourth round of national elections. The mandate to form government was given to Yair Lapid. He has 20 or so more days to form a coalition. We heard today that Naftali Bennett is having second thoughts about going with Lapid, but we don't know whether it's final or not. Another factor at play, of course, is Netanyahu's legal battle. Many people in Israel don't trust that Netanyahu's considerations and decisions are not affected by the fact that he's on trial. And that's a very big debate within Israeli society itself. And of course, the main factor at play is the mainstreaming of Kahana's legacy. The fact that Netanyahu had to play for his base and had to support elements that support Meir Kahana's legacy enter the Knesset. They instigate trouble all over the place. There's hard evidence. The Israeli chief of police just went on television describing the way they're busing rioters around, instigating trouble all over the place. When you think of cities like Akko and Bat Yam, those were not organic riots. Those were riots that were instigated by external forces. So these are the factors at play on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, the factors at play are also similar. They also have a lot to do with the internal situation within the Palestinian Authority. If you probably paid attention to what's happening in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas just entered the 15th year of his 4-year term. He promised elections many, many years ago, hasn't happened. And he indicated that he's interested in conducting another round of democratic elections for the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, that felt it had a good chance of winning the elections, was very disappointed to learn of Mahmoud Abbas's decision to cancel the elections. So this has a lot to do with what you're seeing. Of course, the Abraham Accords, we spoke about it. They feel that they're being pushed to the sidelines by history, if you may. The Abraham Accord were celebrated all over the world, with the exception of the Palestinians. The only ones who did not bless and said this is a wonderful thing were the Palestinians, and of course the Iranians. Hamas and Iran have an axis. Iran is also cultivating the axis with Hezbollah. Iran, as I said before, is waiting for the right moment to claim its revenge, and this is also another factor at play on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, it's important to understand Israel is facing several fronts. In many ways, it's unprecedented. Israel is facing, obviously, the situation in Hamas. Hamas has demonstrated very impressive military capabilities. I dare to say that the Israeli military was surprised by it. Israel is facing unrest in the West Bank, especially in the eastern part of Jerusalem. Israel is facing the possibility, which is very real. I will not be surprised if we will hear about inflammation along the northern border with Hezbollah. Again, remember, Iran is behind the scenes pulling the strings. Israel is facing, obviously, the war against Iran hasn't ended. It's still going on day in and day out. We call it the Cold War, but it's actually a very warm war. Israel is facing the unrest of the Israeli Arabs. We can talk about that during the Q&A session, why the Israeli Arabs are so disgruntled. And of course, Israel will have to face its radical right. We've seen things that we've never seen before in Israel, like Jews lynching Arabs, very, very tough images and tough things to absorb if you're an Israeli, if you're a Zionist, if you care about the future of the state of Israel. What are the risk factors? The first risk factor, of course, is that the years and years and years, decades of work to heal the rift between Jews and Arabs and Muslims in the state of Israel will go down the drain. It's a very real possibility because of, again, information overload. People are being exposed to images that otherwise would not have been exposed to. This would have an impact. The danger of widespread anarchy, very much like what happened in the United States when the government doesn't believe, when elected officials do not believe in their civil service, when they're not building them up, when they don't trust them, when they use terms like deep state. In the moment of truth, that civil service, including law enforcement, including the military, may not be able to perform at the level that they should. And this is exactly what you're seeing today in Israel, the collapse of the entire system. Police is unable to stop the anarchy. They're talking about asking the military to intervene in places like Lod and others. Loss of trust and confidence. Again, COVID-19 was a very traumatic chapter all over the world of people realizing the systemic deficiencies of their own governments. Add to that the fact that Israelis now are looking at what's happening. Tel Aviv is under attack, 250 rockets in one night. Iron Dome system is very limited in what it can do. And Israelis are losing their confidence and their trust, not only in their government, but also, sadly, in the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli police. And lastly, the risk factor on the Palestinian-Israeli political side is very much like Camp David. We're looking at a very dangerous situation where this could take us back a generation or two in terms of the ability to create an effective kind of negotiations. Who stands to gain? Hamas definitely positioned itself as a main actor, reinforced its position within the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, they show resistance. We have to remind our viewers today that Mahmoud Abbas, whether you like him or not, he's the first Palestinian leader to commit himself and the Palestinian Authority to nonviolence. Hamas, of course, does not accept the idea of nonviolence. The second thing that Hamas should be, as far as they're concerned, obviously, we should all be very sad about it, but they should be very happy about it, that they took a step towards turning this conflict into a religious conflict. The conflict that Israel has with the national movement of the Palestinian people is a political conflict by definition, and could and should be resolved politically and diplomatically. The conflict that Israel has with groups such as Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and others is a religious conflict. And with them, there is no compromise. They're not interested in talking to Israel or compromising with Israel or reaching an agreement with Israel. They're interested in implementing their maximalist view, which is the annihilation of the state of Israel. Netanyahu himself, as the individual, as the person, stands to gain from this situation. It helps him to block the attempts of Lapid and Bennett to form a coalition that will replace him. This is not a done deal yet, but it is possible that he would be successful doing so. And of course, creating a national sense of urgency and anxiety, which helps him, generally speaking. Iran stands to gain. Again, as I said before, this may have been the beginning of the Iranian revenge, but also it's just a continuation, another small victory in their attempts to destabilize the region by using proxy forces all over the region, from Yemen to Bahrain to Syria, and of course, to the Gaza Strip. Who stands to lose? Of course, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority that are weakening as this conflict continues. The other Abbas, Mansur Abbas, the leader of the Arab-Israeli party Ra'am, who was willing to negotiate and enter the Lapid-Bennett coalition, finds himself in a weakened position. Lapid and Bennett themselves find themselves in a very weak position as a result of this. Lapid may lose the only chance that he had to form a change coalition. Bennett, if he will go to another round of elections, if Bennett doesn't join Lapid to replace Netanyahu, it means that we're more likely in 20 days, we're more likely to see another round of elections. This will be election number 5. I don't know if Bennett will do better in round number 5 than he did in round number 4. Let me remind our viewers that in round number 3, he didn't even make it into the Knesset. And Saar, of course, who has 7 seats, may also stand to lose from a 5th round of elections. And of course, the biggest victim of what we're seeing, of this anarchy, of this unrest, is Arab-Jewish coexistence that was always fragile. Possible scenarios. There are 3 large scenarios, possible scenarios. The first is that we will see the end of belligerency in the coming days. It may take a couple of weeks, but eventually it will subside. It happened before. Another possibility is that the Hezbollah in the north will join in, will find a reason to join in, and that will create an entirely new situation for the state of Israel. Again, unprecedented. Israel will be attacked on both fronts. Again, as I said before, the home front will become the main story. And the third option, which probably is more likely to be the one that we will see in months to come, is the continuation of the conflict in a different kind of intensity. It will not completely go away, but we will see every once in a while rockets. We will see every once in a while Hamas is targeting. And don't forget that also in the Gaza Strip, we have the Islamic Jihad, which is not necessarily aligned with Hamas, and they usually work independently. And so with that, I would like to open the floor for your questions, if I may.
So we had a couple of questions that arrived via email, and they take us, I think, to the beginning of the conflict, the escalation of recent days. Who decided to let Haredi youth onto Temple Mount and why?
Well, I guess it was the, in Israel, you have the minister of in charge of police, and you have ultimately the prime minister is responsible. But I believe in that case, it was a police decision.
Okay. And who decided to let the police follow protesters into Al-Aqsa Mosque and fire tear gas into the mosque?
As I said before, when you lose control, you lose control. Very similar to what happened on January 6th, what happened in other places. Look, you also have to understand the halo effect. The halo effect is a very real thing. If you remember what happened here when George Floyd was murdered, the vast majority of people that decided to protest were peaceful protesters. But you always have those people who feel disenfranchised, who feel they're not part of the collective, who feel that they're underprivileged, disadvantaged, who take advantage of the situation. So that's exactly what's happening here on the Arab side and on the Israeli side. There's no question about it that both communities should be better controlled and governed by their leadership.
We have a couple of questions that relate to Sheikh Jarrah, and basically, if you can explain the eviction of Arabs from their homes in East Jerusalem and how this plays into the current crisis. Why did it take so many years to settle this or to get to this real estate dispute?
Well, that's an historical debate of whether you accept the fact that ownership over land or houses is something that is legal. There were attempts by Jews, actually many American Jews. I'm not familiar with Canadian Jews who were involved in this, but many American Jews that funded the ongoing expansion of Jewish presence in East Jerusalem, and they were buying property. At some point, the Arabs that sold the property, some of them even lost their lives as a result. But it's an ongoing story. If you remember, Ariel Sharon had, I don't remember who bought the house for him, but he decided, again, I think Itamar Ben-Gvir was trying to duplicate what Ariel Sharon did and said, I'm going to have an office there. And of course, it's not helpful. There's no question about it. It's not helpful when it happens in the wrong timing. This is what happens. Could really, you can light the fire, but you can never know, what would be the intensity of the fire.
That's right. How will we be able to return to Arab-Jewish coexistence? Can organizations on the ground help?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, there are many, I know that it sounds a little too optimistic to some people that I talk about it today, but every piece of research that we have about the Israeli society shows that the Arab Israelis, by and large, are very happy to be part of the state of Israel. They're very proud of being Israeli, about 70% of them. They really don't care about the plight of the Palestinian national movement. If you force them, they will say, yeah, we support the Palestinians, but they really don't care. They care about what normal people care about. They want to put food on their table. They want to provide their children with health, with safety, and with education. And that's largely the situation. That's the first thing I'd like to say. Secondly, the light at the end of the tunnel here is that it creates a sense of urgency among those who care about Arab-Jewish coexistence. I'll give you an example. Today, where I live, and I'm surrounded in Jerusalem. We live outside of Jerusalem, surrounded by 3 Palestinian villages and 1 Arab-Israeli village, Abu Ghosh, right? So we have Bidu, Bet Zurik, and Kubebe, and Katana, so four villages around my house. And in the back, we have an Arab-Israeli village called Abu Ghosh. And tonight in Israel, a few hours ago, there was a huge rally of hundreds of people, Arabs and Jews, rallying in favor of peaceful coexistence, showing their support. Basically, they decided to go out to the streets to show their support for peaceful coexistence, following the plight made by President Rivlin, who gave a speech last night urging people to curb extremism and to show the support for peaceful coexistence. So I believe that this will create a renewed sense of urgency. More money will flow into Arab-Jewish dialogue groups, and actually something good may happen after this conflict is resolved.
I wish that we would all see this abroad as well, because those are indeed positive news to see both people marching together. David Rosner is asking if Israel's policy in the West Bank were not dominated by right-wing extremist elements, could this have been prevented?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. This should have been prevented. The onus is on Israel to prevent such things, because Israel is the country where you have rule of law and you have strong military and strong law enforcement. And it's certainly, as we say in Hebrew, that's a takala, right? That's an error. It's an error made by the Israeli government, by Israeli law enforcement. There's no question about this. This should not have happened. I want you to understand how information overload is working overtime here. I have nieces and nephews that live in a lovely neighborhood in southern Tel Aviv called Florentine. They left the neighborhood, went back to their parents' home because they saw messages on WhatsApp groups that the Arabs are planning to riot Florentine. Now, to say that you want to riot Florentine is like rioting, I don't know what,
downtown of any major city, yeah.
Thornhill, right? So that's the situation. Now, whether Florentine is in danger or not, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that it creates massive hysteria and massive anxiety. And so young people are leaving their homes because they're afraid of lynching and rioting.
Yeah, Michael Fromstein is asking, I read Bennett was going back to Netanyahu. Have you heard that?
Well, yes, I did. The report in the Israeli media is that Bennett says behind closed doors that the option of a change coalition is no longer on the table because of the political and security situation. It should be reminded to all of our viewers, Netanyahu does not have a coalition even with Bennett. He does not have a coalition.
Now, talking about coalition, do you think that Mansur Abbas would get the courage to go back to the negotiating table?
Yeah, I think Mansur Abbas is playing what we call realpolitik. He's not interested in ideology. He's interested. He says, show me the money. If you are going to give me a piece of the budget pie, I will be a partner. And all I want is money, because money is infrastructure. Money is achievements on the ground. Money, it means that I can be the king, right? And he totally gets it, by the way. He totally gets it. This is what the ultra-Orthodox have done in Israeli politics for decades. Show me the money. And so there's no doubt in my mind, he already announced that this will not deter him from joining a future coalition. Lapid can form a coalition without Bennett, but it will rely on the votes of the Arabs. From the outside, and maybe Mansur Abbas from the inside, it's hard to tell. But right now, as the conflict on the ground, as the fighting goes on, I think that no one really has the bandwidth to discuss coalition politics right now. So this will have to wait until things will subside.
Monet Malevsky is asking, on the home front, why has the government and police not answered the call of the Arab Israelis for help in their neighbor with crime among the youth?
Well, I don't know if they haven't. We have to understand that it's a very difficult situation. A big portion of Israeli police officers are Arabs. So this is a very tricky situation. So when you look at Al-Fahim, which is the largest Arab town in Israel, most of the police officers in Al-Fahim are from Al-Fahim. So we have to remember that a big number of Israeli police are Arabs. Same thing goes for the firefighters. Same thing goes for MDA and United Hatzalah and all those first response organizations. Many of them are Arab Israelis. and it puts them in this very, very difficult position.
Do you see here a thread of the ill function of the police, starting with the bad decision with Damascus Gate, having a chief of police who's been nominated after 2 years of not having any chief of the police?
Yeah.
Do you see this?
Yeah. Again, this all stems from the mistrust of the political leadership of the elected officials in their own civil service. And it's not unique to Israel. It's happening all over the world. It happened here in the United States for 4 years. When people don't trust the police, when people don't trust their diplomats, when they don't trust their Secret Service, when they don't trust the Ministry of Interior, in the moment of truth, it's very difficult for those institutions to perform the way they should because they were undermined for years. And we have to understand, same thing goes for the Israeli healthcare system. We have not built, with the exception of Asuta in Ashdod, we have not built a new hospital in decades. Israel went down on the list of countries on the OECD members in terms of beds per person, per capita. So this is in the moment of truth, when you don't invest in your own public service cannot function adequately. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
Gustavo Zentner is asking, wouldn't the Ministry of the Interior, Internal Affairs, not be capable to anticipate the potential risk of Sheikh Jarrah?
Yeah, they should have, but they also should have anticipated what happened in Mount Meron. 48 people lost their lives because of negligence. And that's it's the same thing. Again, when the system doesn't function, bad things happen, and the system doesn't function. There's a price to a government that is being thrown from one election campaign to another for 2.5 years now. And the people are paying the price, both Jews and Arabs.
We have a question from Annie Sorono, which I think reflects the frustration more than anything. How is it possible that there is no military solution with a superpower like Israel? By removing the barrier from Sha'ar Shechem, that is viewed as Hamas, by Hamas as weakness.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, actually. Here's the thing. Even in war, in diplomacy, the assumption is that even in the most chaotic situation, you have to create some rules of engagement, right? So when you look at the Geneva Convention says even in the most chaotic of situations, war, we have to adhere to certain rules. We have to comply, for example, with the rule that says you don't kill prisoners of war, and so on and so forth. And that is based on the assumption that both sides in the conflict value life, cherish life, and they work under the assumption that their job is the preservation of life, right? When you join the military, and many people on the call know this, they teach you all sorts of procedures. And the reason why they teach you procedures, including how to tie your shoelaces, right, is so that to do what we call loss prevention, to prevent a situation of loss of life. Now, what do you do with an enemy that doesn't care about life? That's a whole different story. What is the military solution to a conflict with an entity like Hamas that is not interested in improving the lives of the Palestinians, that is using children as human shields, that is using ambulances to transport missiles? Hamas had 15 years to turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East. No one interrupted them, believe me. I was there. If they wanted to turn Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East, they could have done so very, very easily. But Hamas is not interested in improving the well-being of the Palestinian people. Unlike Abbas, by the way. They have their own issues. But Hamas comes from a different point of view. Now, what do you do when your enemy wants to die? What was the big surprise factor 9/11? No one thought about the idea that 19 hijackers are going to commit this suicide mission because they do not care about their own lives. It's a game changer. It means that even the Geneva Convention cannot help. And you need to rewrite the rules of how you fight those enemies. And so what is the solution? Israel can flatten the entire Gaza Strip, then what? So there is no military solution. The only solution is diplomacy. Unfortunately, when people fire and the missiles are being being fired, I'm sorry, no one has, again, the attention or the bandwidth to deal with diplomacy, sadly, because this is exactly when diplomacy can and should be effective.
Diego Skladnik is asking, what is the state of Israel doing to fight the situation in the social media and BDS, where regular people seems to be on the Palestinian side and seeing Israel about a colonialist state? I'm concerned, he adds, that the new generation of Jews living in the diaspora do not have the connection with Israel, nor the desire to fight back.
Yeah, so there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that this is nothing new. Most Jews in North America never supported Zionism. In fact, the biggest opposition to Zionism came from Jews. So that's the bad news. The good news is that those little devices allow us also to communicate our own country independently. So if in the old days it was all about what the prime minister said or what a couple of Tom Friedman said, then today you have 9.5 million Israelis communicating their country independently, and only good things happen. I can tell you, as someone who just came back from 2 weeks in Hollywood to discuss Israeli movie industry, Israel is being admired in the places that matter. So it's true. In the academic world, Israel is in a disadvantage, always have been. Zionism was never the bon ton of the academic world, never. It's a myth that we tell ourselves about ourselves. Zionism was never celebrated by intellectuals, not even Jewish intellectuals. Albert Einstein was unique in the sense that he proclaimed himself as a Zionist. Many of them did not, and we have to remember that. Now, having said that, the colonialist narrative is catching on, especially among the young. Again, it's a direct result of information overload. Because colonialist narrative that says, and I'll explain what is the narrative. The colonialist narrative looks at Israel as a phenomenon of European colonialism. Just as Europe ended its colonialist chapter with France pulling out of Algeria in 1965, 2 years later, Israel started its colonialist chapter. Now, here's the narrative. The state of Israel, according to this narrative, is a byproduct of the Holocaust. This narrative is ignoring completely the decades of nation building before the Holocaust, right? I don't have to tell you, the Hebrew was founded in 1925, Betzalel 1906, the Haganah was founded in 1920, the trade union, the Histadrut, was founded in 1920. So they ignore all of that. Right? Moshe Montefiore built a neighborhood in Jerusalem in 1860. My own family came in 1870. They ignore all of that. It never happened. Israel is a product of the Holocaust, which means that the poor indigenous Palestinians are actually paying the price for the crimes of the Europeans against Jews. So because of guilt, the Europeans decided to give the Jews a state at the expense of the Palestinians. That's the narrative. Now, if you are ill-informed, if you are uninterested in the details, if you are part of the Instagram generation that responds only to images, they don't even read anymore, then it's so easy to get people to believe in that. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. So in many ways, the Israeli narrative is a victim of information overload, of the yearning of people to find simple answers to highly complex solutions. Now, the only thing that we can aspire for is to get people to understand the complexity of the situation. We should not aspire off the bat with someone we don't know to have them completely accept the Israeli side. It's not going to happen. There has to be an interim stage, and that interim stage is for them to understand that it's not black and white. It's not zero sum. It's very complex. This is the most that we can aspire for at this particular situation.
And do you think indeed the Israeli government is doing enough to explain, to present the complexity of the situation on a state level?
No, as I said before, the Israelis live in an alternative reality. It's a different planet. The Israeli society, it's not just the Israeli political system, it's the Israeli society, it's the Israeli media. I'm watching the news, I'm reading the newspapers. It's everything in Israel. They live on a different planet. In their planet, they are the victim, clearly. And everything that they do stems from that realization that they are the victim. They see themselves as the victims historically. And when you take youth to the death camps in Europe for decades, that's what's going to happen. People develop a very strong sense of victimhood. Again, you can argue with that, but that's a fact. David Ben-Gurion warned against this. If you watch the movie Ben-Gurion Epilogue, he talks about how Israel should look at the German people, how people should look at the Holocaust today. And he urged people, look forward, don't be obsessed with the past. Unfortunately, Israel became obsessed with the past, too obsessed to the point it really detached from the global agenda. I'll give you just a simple example. Climate change, right, is supposedly unrelated to what's happening now with Hamas, right? But very related. In Israel, climate change is a non-issue. Non-issue. Why? Because the Israelis are not connected to the global agenda. The sense, that sentiment that you're all getting from your friends, the Israelis are completely unaware of it. You have to understand it. It's a different reality. They live in a different place with a different mentality. And in their mentality, in Israel's mentality, Israel is clearly the victim historically. And again, I can make a very convincing, compelling case for Israel, the victim, but I would need a full academic semester to do that. Whereas the Palestinians have to show one picture of the boy versus the tank, and they get the whole story right there.
So Norm Isley is asking about the strategy of fighting in Gaza. He says, Israel cannot eliminate the missile barrage unless it can know where the missiles are in civilian areas. You cannot send notices in advance of an incoming attack and expect to hit your target. There is no alternative, but civilians will be killed. A ceasefire is a defeat for Israel, as Hamas will only build up again. What will Israel do?
It's an excellent question. Look, first of all, if you see the footage of Israel destroying buildings in Gaza, first of all those buildings are empty. But you see the black smoke coming out. That means that the building actually is being used in the basement as a depot for missiles. And that's what the IDF is trying to do, to destroy as many piles of missiles as possible with causing as minimal collateral damage as possible. They're not always successful, but I can tell you as someone who was there at the IDF command center in 2009, and I was there at the IDF command center in 2006 with the war in Lebanon. I can tell you with the ultimate degree of certainty that the IDF is extremely sensitive about collateral damage. So yeah, it's correct. Unfortunately, people suffer. Many Palestinians suffer. Many Palestinians die. But it could have been much worse if Israel had not had that degree of sensitivity and caring about that collateral damage issue. But the goal right now is to destroy the basements where they keep the missiles.
So in regard to the IDF, Helen is asking, She's saying, you said that the Israeli public has lost faith in the IDF. Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, the expectation of the average Israeli is there was even a slogan many years ago in Hebrew, let the IDF win. Nu letzahal lenatzeach, right? Why? Where is it coming from? It comes from a different era where the war was mostly on the ground, and it was mostly between infantry and armored corps and so on. But it's a different kind of war. You're fighting people you're not sure whether they're civilians or not. They don't look like soldiers. They carry weapons, but they're dressed like civilians. It's a non-state actor, and it's very difficult to have a decisive victory against a non-state actor. A guerrilla war is a different kind of war. And so how do you win a guerrilla war? ISIS lost the war once they took a territory, right? So you had maybe I don't know how many people ISIS had, 20,000 at the height, and they controlled a territory the size of Texas. How can 20,000 people effectively control a territory the size of Texas? It was an easy decision. I always said that the only thing that stands between ISIS and annihilation is an American decision. And once the Americans decided to do away with ISIS, it was not a big deal. But this is not the situation. Here you have almost 2 million people crammed in one small territorial unit called the Gaza Strip, with lots of children, lots of women, lots of innocent people. What are you going to do? So I think that the IDF is trying its best. I don't think that people lost confidence. I think there's a danger that they will lose confidence. Their expectation to have a swift victory is not going to be fulfilled. And it creates frustration and creates anxiety. And people are becoming impatient because they were used to the idea of declaring victory. And it's very tempting. If you remember George W. Bush going to Iraq, announcing that mission complete, right? It came from the same place, the desire to announce victory. And of course, we know how many years the United States kept on fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the mission was far from being complete.
So Jerome Adirim is asking, when do you think things will settle down? Is it settling down now or increasing in intensity?
It will probably settle down, but I don't think it will settle down completely. It will continue. And again, it has a lot to do with what will happen on the coalition negotiations fronts. I think that it may take a long time. Maybe not, it will not continue in the same level of intensity, but it will continue for a long time.
Sani Tavel is asking, as you said earlier, Israel is always seen as the aggressor in any terrorist missile attacks. The press tells us today 80 plus Arabs have been killed and only 7 Israelis have died, only. How can we as Zionists in Canada turn this around?
Well, when you look at the fact that there were more Nazis killed in Berlin, doesn't mean that the Nazis were on the right, right? More Germans died in the war, so what? Doesn't make them the right side. So the point is, we don't, looking at the number of fatalities cannot be the measurement. The measurement has to be looking at the general context. And as I said before, the big philosophical question is very simple. What do you do with an enemy that does not want compromise? And I'm not talking about the Palestinian Authority, I'm talking about Hamas. What do you do with an enemy that once you're dead, no matter what, it doesn't care to die in the process? I'll give you an example, okay? When you look at the leaders of Hamas who were urging young people to become jihadists, by the way, none of their children ever became a jihadist. None of them became a martyr. It was always the other's person's children that were urged to become.
They went actually to universities abroad.
Exactly. Their children were educated in the best universities in Europe. But the idea of asking a mother to let her son become a shaheed, to die. Think about it. And unfortunately, it's part of the reality we live in.
So Daniel Glickman is asking, is the two-state solution still possible? What if Hamas wins an election? On the other hand, if one-state solution, how Israel can be Jewish and democratic?
So the two-state solution is the only solution on the table that will safeguard Israel's future as a Jewish state. If Hamas wins the West Bank, it means that Iran completed its goal of turning the conflict into a religious conflict. And I don't have to tell you what happens to religious conflict. Very slim chance of diplomacy succeeding in, as long as the conflict is about territory, as long as the conflict is political, national even, can be resolved. When the conflict moves into the realm of religious beliefs, then we're going back to the discussion of enlightenment versus absolutism. What is the reason? What is the difference between the age of reason and the age of belief? That facts and science prevail, right? We are at a university event right now. And if someone say, I believe that the world is flat, and I show you evidence that the world is not flat, and you still say my belief is more important than your facts, then what are you going to do? That's exactly the problem of religious conflicts. When belief overcomes reason, there's very little you can do. And you look at Catholicism versus the Protestants, you look at what's happening in India between the Muslims and the Hindus, and those conflicts can last for ages, unfortunately.
Is there a way of getting the Gaza population to revolt against Hamas? Gideon Stoller is asking this question.
Highly unlikely. They're not empowered enough. Unfortunately, I know that the vast majority of people in Gaza just want to have normal life. They're not going to have it as long as Hamas is in control. So I don't think it's a possible scenario. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are controlling everything in Gaza, including the tunnels. I don't know if you know that, but the tunnel is like a super highway of products and even the television cables and cellular cables are going through the tunnels from the Sinai, and they control and they take their commission, and they basically control every aspect of life in the Gaza Strip.
Deborah Goldberg is asking, do you think that the Israelis and the Israeli Arabs who did live together in peace will be able to establish their former relationships?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it creates a degree of mistrust. But listen, where I live, we had a similar situation with the Palestinian. So I live in a small community called Harada, the Radar Hill. And we have Palestinians that come from nearby villages to work in Harada, and some of them work in construction, some of them do. One guy who was working as a housekeeper for 15 years, his wife left him. She was Jordanian. She left him back to her father who lived in Jordan, and left him with 4 children. That's in the eyes of the Palestinian men a calamity, a huge embarrassment. His wife left him. She claimed that he was abusive to her. And now the Palestinian Authority, if you're a shaheed, your immediate family members are eligible to receive a stipend until for the rest of their lives. So what was his solution to the predicament he was in as a result of his wife's decision to leave him? And of course, the embarrassment, the public embarrassment, everybody's talking about it. So he takes out a gun. He goes to the checkpoint at 7 a.m. in the morning, and he kills 3 people that he knows, because he was coming in and out for 15 years, this guy. He knows the people. Who did he kill? He killed 3 security people. He killed 1 Arab Israeli from Abu Ghosh. He killed our neighbor's son who was working security, and he killed an Ethiopian border patrol officer. And then a female border patrol officer was able to neutralize him and shut him down. Here is the story in a nutshell. You have a microcosm. Here's a guy that, for whatever reason, when he decided to unload his wrath, he did it on Jews. And he killed, in the process, he killed an Arab Muslim as well. The point is that 3 years later, 4 years later, it happened 4 years ago, we're back to normal. And so it takes time, but we have to be optimistic in the inertia of life. And people, have, at the end of the day, you're dealing with human beings. And I remember during the time after that incident, when this person killed 3 people, there were many people in my community that sent money to Palestinians that were not allowed to come in to work in our community, because they were concerned about how they're going to make a living. So there were many people in where I live that sent money to the Palestinians on the other side of the fence.
Ido, I would like to end on this optimistic note that we can and will continue to help one another in this very delicate region. I want to thank you for your time and the opportunity that you share with us your vast knowledge. We always like to invite you and hear you talk. And I may summarize it by saying that maybe 2020 was not such a bad year. And on this a bit humoristic note, we will thank everyone for joining our program and wish you all a good rest of day. Thank you, Ido.